following segment of my video blog will be noisier than usual. I'm going deep behind enemy lines. Hello and welcome to my video blog number 6. I am deep within the belly of the beast. I am at Harborview Medical Center ICU in Seattle, Washington. And my topic today is Chinese medicine versus Western medicine. This is a topic I would generally prefer to avoid whenever possible, as I tend to pretty much piss off everyone on both sides of the argument. However, my friend Daryl asked me, and Chinese medicine tends to focus on function rather than form, whereas Western medicine tends to focus on form rather than function. I don't ascribe to the idea of a war between Chinese medicine and Western medicine. However, most people in the West see Chinese medicine in relationship or compared to Western medicine and don't really have any other way of thinking about Chinese medicine. Whereas, having studied Chinese medicine for 20 years now, I can think of Chinese medicine as existing solely on its own terms. Well, that's as far as I could get with my video blog in that particular environment. There's just too many interruptions, people in and out all the time, alarms going off all the time, as I'm sure you heard. Chinese medicine can be viewed as part of a larger body of Chinese work, which includes martial arts, calligraphy, feng shui, all the Chinese arts. These arts are all utilizing the same foundational principles, such as the principle of yin and yang, and the idea of striking a balance between opposing forces, or the idea of things constantly changing and opposites eventually becoming each other, and that sort of thing. These principles play out throughout all traditional Chinese thought, and Chinese medicine is just one manifestation of that. To diagnose something in Chinese terms often means considering observable phenomena, and I mean observable without taking blood, without using scans, without any high-tech equipment, because none of those things existed when Chinese medicine was created. So people needed to be very skillful at bringing insight to their observations in order to diagnose someone in Chinese medical terms. Often the way these diagnoses sound, especially to the outsider, is much like the weather. We can all observe weather. It has, a range of temperature, a range of humidity, a range of turbulence, a range of stagnation, and these concepts can just as readily be applied to the human body as they can be to weather. A pathogen, some sort of invasive force that comes into our bodies and causes a fever, would be a hot pathogen, and that shouldn't be all that startling. Even in the West, we talk about catching a cold, which is not Western medical science. That's something much more subjective, which says, well, the weather was cold, I started to feel chilled, and something cold came into my body. And that's exactly how Chinese medicine talks about catching a cold. A cold wind blew in, and then it got stuck in my body somewhere, and now I feel chills. And these concepts aren't all that far-fetched if we are used to observing nature, if we are aware of the cycles of nature and the manifestations of nature through things such as weather, but not limited to weather. Much Chinese medical diagnosis sounds a great deal like that. Part of the beauty of that, of course, is that if you've ever had a blood draw, it's not pleasant, and Chinese medicine doesn't require things like blood draws or invasive scans or radiation in order to gather information. However, it does require a fair bit of skill and insight and practice. If you took that same kind of money that has gone into allopathic, that's the mainstream form of Western medicine, take that same amount of money that has gone into allopathic medicine over recent centuries and put that kind of money into Chinese medicine, it would be fascinating to see what people would do and how high-tech Chinese medicine might become. But since Chinese medicine has never had that kind of money and basically evolved from a third world economy, it's about being able to utilize what's on hand, what grows in nature. Items like acupuncture needles, they are kind of high-tech, but they're not that expensive to manufacture, not like an MRI machine. One of the major differences that I see between Chinese medicine and allopathic Western medicine is simply an economic one. Chinese medicine is not really a way to get rich. It's probably been done, but most people I know in the profession kind of get by or give up and bail and go back to having a straight job. It could only be leveled, really, if you took all the money out of the equation. And of course, that's, well, I don't know what the future holds, but right now that seems quite far-fetched. And Chinese medicine is relatively cheap to perform. Acupuncture needles tend to be shipped from Japan. Herbs that are used in Chinese medical practice tend to be shipped from China and fumigated heavily. I wouldn't consider those sustainable practices either, and that's where I start to piss off all my Chinese medical colleagues. And one can easily argue, and most Chinese medical practitioners do argue, well, this is safer than pharmaceuticals, which are toxic by nature, because you cannot patent something that isn't toxic, and you cannot make a profit from something that isn't patented. So it's simply a fact that all pharmaceutical medications are toxic by design. Chinese herbs, yes, they're natural. That doesn't exactly make them safe, because there are toxic things in nature. In case you've never encountered a rattlesnake or something, we all know this. There are things in nature that are poisonous, and there are things that are then, maybe more or less inert and non-toxic, but then get treated with toxins or packaged in toxins and shipped around the planet, and it's not really all that sustainable. So this is how I got roped into doing things like medical intuitive work and medical qigong, because it is 100% sustainable. It doesn't require any stuff at all. Now, obviously, life itself requires stuff to some extent, but nonetheless, I get excited about things like not creating medical waste. Call me weird. Chinese medicine seems weird to Westerners simply because most of us didn't grow up with the concepts and didn't grow up with the practices of Chinese medicine, and did grow up with the concepts and practices of Western medicine. And many people, when they argue against Chinese medicine, argue that they basically don't understand how it works, which begs the question if they understand how Western medicine works, because for many years aspirin was doled out by doctors who did not know how it worked. They just noticed that it did. I don't think there are very many people who are not trained in medicine who actually know how pharmaceuticals work in the human body, or are able to read any of the tests that are part and parcel of Western medical diagnosis. Western medicine, of course, depends on the idea of scientific objectivity, which is an extremely well thought of concept. Everything that Western allopathic medicine attempts to do is based upon objective Western medical science. And it's easy to see something like a CAT scan as objective. That machine that performs that scan does not have an opinion and cannot be convinced of saying one thing over another thing just because you paid it a lot of money or something. So yes, a CAT scan itself can be seen as scientifically objective. However, a CAT scan requires an interpretation by a living, breathing human being who has their own filters, if you will, their own opinions, their own desires of what this outcome is, and those things influence their interpretation. So as soon as the scan enters human hands, it ceases to be objective science, and it becomes something more like a hopefully skilled, educated opinion, which is an opinion. An opinion is not science. Say you have a really burny, itchy, scratchy throat, a very severe sore throat, and you decide to go to the doctor to get a diagnosis and a treatment. So, to do this scientifically, the doctor would take a swab of your throat and send that off to a lab, and the lab would do a culture of that swab and then identify the pathogen if they find a pathogen. And then those results would be sent back to the doctor from the lab, and the doctor, based on the identity of the pathogen, then would prescribe an antibiotic which is known to treat that pathogen. That is a scientific process, but that isn't what normally happens. In case you haven't noticed, you go to the doctor, they check you out, they make a subjective call, which is basically a guess. Now, you can say it's an educated guess. I won't argue with that. You can even say, it could be an accurate guess. Well, of course it could be, but there's no guarantee. It's not science. When a doctor looks at you and guesses what you have and then prescribes based upon their guess and circumvents the lab work, which is the scientific part, then you are getting something that is at a lower standard of accuracy. You're getting a guess instead of science, and you're getting that pharmaceutical quickly instead of 2 days later, which is why this often happens, because people don't want to wait 2 days for their prescription. From that viewpoint, there is this failure of Western medicine to be as scientific as it wants us to think. And its credibility is based solely on this idea of objective Western science, which is then practiced as a form of medicine. I have criticisms of every form of medicine I've ever encountered, just for the record. I'm not trying to just pick on Western medicine. I just think people should know that there's a lot that gets passed off as science that isn't. If you want to get Western allopathic care, I suggest you make sure that it's scientific as possible at every step of the way, because that's what the whole thing is based on, and then you're getting a quality of allopathic Western care. Now, within Chinese medicine, there is a lot of pieces missing, because the Chinese government picked them out before Chinese medicine was exported, and a lot of Westerners want to fit into the Western medical system, so they try to disguise an apple as an orange, and I think that's a terrible disservice to Chinese medicine. There's also the fact that a rather unskilled Chinese medical practitioner can seem at least as skilled as a highly skilled Chinese medical practitioner because of banking on people's ignorance about Chinese medicine. Medical bureaus don't really know how to measure the skill of Chinese medical practitioners. Hence, they make Chinese medical students take lots of classes in Western medicine, which have almost no relevance to the actual practice of Chinese medicine, or the actual understanding of Chinese medicine, or the actual skill. So, finding a skilled Chinese medical practitioner, I wouldn't even know how to tell you to do that. Diagnosis itself is an art, and it's not something that is readily taught. And after 3 or 4 years of acupuncture school, one may still be quite unskilled at diagnosis. An academic approach is notoriously not good at teaching arts. Anybody who has studied any art knows there's only so much that can be taught. You teach someone the basics, and then they either have what it takes or they don't, and then they develop what they have under tutelage of a master, perhaps, but oftentimes they just remain in a place of mediocrity. So perhaps I have simply complicated this subject further, but there's only so much that I can cover in a short period of time that YouTube allows me to upload, but I do hope this conversation is of interest and informative, and of course if it lends to another question that I can spend 10 or 15 minutes talking about, then I will talk about that some more. Thank you for watching.